Jannik Sinner has spent the better part of 2 years doing something almost no one in men's tennis manages to do consistently. He has stayed at the top. Wimbledon in July was proof of that. His fifth Grand Slam, defended, on the surface that was supposed to expose his weaknesses instead of confirming his dominance. But 3 weeks before the last major of the year, the world number one is not preparing to defend a title. He is standing on the sidelines, watching the biggest rival of his career walk back into the spotlight without him. That is not the story anyone expected in August. Because the man returning is Carlos Alcaraz, and for 4 months, Alcaraz was the one who was supposed to be missing. So here is the real question this video is going to answer. What does it mean when the player who is healthy has to sit out, right as the player who was broken gets to walk back in? Is this bad luck, or is it revealing something deeper about how fragile even the best bodies in tennis actually are? Let's start with what we know for certain. On August 21st, Sinner withdrew from the 2026 US Open. The announcement came in his own words, posted publicly, explaining a right knee injury that had been lingering since the build-up to the North American hard court swing. He had already pulled out of the Canadian Open, then Cincinnati. Then, in the days before the deadline, his team took him back onto a practice court in Monte Carlo to test whether the knee could hold up under real pressure. It couldn't. That single detail, the fact that they tested it right up to the wire, tells you something the official statement doesn't say directly. This wasn't a cautious, early, better safe than sorry decision. This was a player and a team who genuinely believed, until the very last moment, that he might be able to play. And that changes how we should read everything that follows. Because Sinner is not the kind of player who pulls out of tournaments casually. Since bursting into the world's top tier, he has built his identity partly around durability, a mechanical, almost engineered game that was supposed to hold up precisely because it avoids unnecessary risk. Watching that same body betray him, twice in a row, at exactly the moment the season's final Grand Slam approached, is not a small footnote. It's a crack in the foundation of how Sinner has been discussed for the past 2 years. Now here's where the story gets more complicated. One day before Sinner's announcement, Carlos Alcaraz posted 2 words that reshaped the entire men's draw. Here we go. Alcaraz had not played a competitive match since mid-April. A wrist injury, reported as tenosynovitis, inflammation of the tissue surrounding the tendon, had taken him out of the French Open, out of Wimbledon, and out of the entire North American hardcourt swing. For a player who had been the reigning US Open champion, missing more than 4 months of the season is not a minor gap. It's the kind of absence that raises real questions about rhythm, confidence, and whether a body that young should already be breaking down. But instead of arriving cautiously, Alcaraz's return included high-intensity training sessions with Holger Rune, the kind of preparation that signals a player planning to compete at full intensity, not simply show up and hope for the best. So think about the timing here. The player who has been out for 4 months is sprinting back in. The player who has barely missed a step for 2 years is being forced to step aside. That contradiction is the entire emotional core of this story. Because if you had asked tennis fans in April which of these two would be more likely to miss the US Open, almost everyone would have said Alcaraz. He was the one in a cast, the one facing a long recovery timeline, the one whose season already looked compromised. Sinner, meanwhile, looked like he was gliding through the year. A Wimbledon title, a knee complaint that seemed like a manageable inconvenience rather than a real threat. And yet here we are. Alcaraz gets his moment back on the biggest stage in New York. Sinner gets a knee that still isn't ready, and a front row seat to watch it happen without him. There's a phrase worth sitting with for a second. Winning can hide problems for a surprisingly long time. Sinner's dominance over the last 2 years may have masked just how much strain his body was absorbing to sustain it. A 5-set Wimbledon campaign, back-to-back Masters runs, a schedule that barely paused. That kind of workload doesn't disappear once the trophies start piling up. It accumulates, and eventually, something has to give. That doesn't mean Sinner's knee injury was inevitable. There's no public evidence connecting a specific match or decision to this specific setback, but it would be too strong to conclude this came out of nowhere either. The pattern of withdrawals, Canada, then Cincinnati, then a failed test in Monte Carlo, tells a story of a body that had been sending signals for weeks before the official statement made it public. Now, consider what Sinner actually said when he made the announcement. He described the decision as difficult and admitted that New York holds, in his words, a special place in his heart. That single sentence matters more than it might seem on the surface. This isn't just any tournament for him. He won the US Open in 2024. He was the runner-up in 2025. A runner-up to the very man who is now taking the spot he can't defend. Sinner isn't simply missing a Masters event or a mid-season stop. He's missing the one Grand Slam most tied to his own career story, at the exact moment his greatest rival returns to reclaim it. That is not a coincidence the story can afford to skip past. Here's another layer most casual coverage has missed. Sinner and Alcaraz have played each other 17 times at the tour level. Their rivalry has become the defining storyline of men's tennis. Rome, Roland Garros, Wimbledon finals, one dramatic three-way exchange after another. But in 2026, they have only met once. Monte Carlo. Sinner won that match. It turned out to be Alcaraz's final appearance, before his wrist injury sidelined him for the next 4 months. So the last image tennis fans have of these two on court together is Sinner beating Alcaraz, right before Alcaraz disappeared from the tour entirely. Now Alcaraz is back, and Sinner is the one disappearing. There's something almost symmetrical about that, and it's worth pausing on. The rivalry that was supposed to define this era of tennis has spent almost the entire year being kept apart by injuries. First Alcaraz's wrist, now Sinner's knee, as if the sport itself keeps interrupting the exact matchup everyone wants to see. Of course, there's a more skeptical way to read this. Some will argue that Sinner's withdrawal has nothing to do with Alcaraz at all, that this is purely a medical decision, made independently, and that connecting the two stories is exactly the kind of narrative building that turns a simple injury update into manufactured drama. And that's a fair point. Sinner's knee doesn't care who else is entering the draw. The decision to protect his long-term health would have been the same regardless of what Alcaraz was doing. But that doesn't mean the emotional weight of the timing isn't real. Athletes don't operate purely on medical logic. They operate inside a competitive context. And the context here is brutal. The rival who was supposed to be recovering is instead walking back onto the exact stage Sinner has to watch from a distance. Because with Sinner out, the entire draw reshapes itself. Alexander Zverev, this year's Roland Garros champion, steps in as the tournament's new top seed. Alcaraz slots in at number 2. Felix Auger-Aliassime becomes the 3rd seed. On paper, that's simply how a bracket adjusts when a world number 1 withdraws. But look at what it actually means. The tournament's biggest storyline, the Sinner-Alcaraz collision that fans have been waiting all year for, has been erased before the draw is even finalized. That is the real cost of this withdrawal, not just for Sinner personally, but for the sport's biggest rivalry as a whole. So what does this actually reveal about where these two players stand right now? For Alcaraz, this is an opportunity wrapped inside genuine risk, coming back after 4 months away, with a new coaching setup following his split from Juan Carlos Ferrero, and testing a surgically sensitive wrist under Grand Slam pressure. That's not a gentle re-entry. If it goes well, he defends his title against a weakened field and re-establishes himself as the man to beat heading into next season. If his wrist doesn't hold up, the questions about his body's durability only get louder. For Sinner, the picture is more uncomfortable. He built his reputation on being the reliable one. Durable, mechanical, rarely injured in the way flashier, more explosive players like Alcaraz often are. That reputation just took its first real hit. Missing the US Open doesn't erase 2 Grand Slam titles or a Wimbledon defense. But it does introduce a question that didn't exist about him a month ago. Is the body built for longevity? Or was it simply lucky until now? That question won't be answered by one withdrawal. It will be answered by what happens when Sinner returns. Whether the knee holds up under the same workload that got him here, or whether this becomes the first entry in a longer pattern. Because here's the part of this story that goes beyond one tournament. Tennis has entered a stretch where its 2 best players can't seem to occupy the same stage. Injuries have kept them apart for almost this entire season, and every time one recovers, the other seems to break down. That's not a storyline anyone in tennis wanted, but it's the one the sport has been handed. The obvious read is that this is simply misfortune. 2 unrelated injuries, coincidentally overlapping. But there's a less comfortable interpretation worth considering. Both players are operating at a physical intensity that modern tennis, with its brutal calendar and 5-set Grand Slam format, may not be built to sustain from either of them indefinitely. Alcaraz's explosive, high-risk style puts enormous strain on his wrists and legs. Sinner's relentless baseline grinding puts sustained pressure on his knees and lower body. Different games, different injuries, same underlying reality. A schedule that doesn't leave much room for anything to go wrong before something eventually does. Only Sinner's team knows exactly how close he was to being ready. Only time will tell whether this knee issue resolves quickly or becomes something more chronic. What we do know is this. At 25, in the prime years of his career, Jannik Sinner is being forced to watch his greatest rival take center stage at the tournament most tied to his own legacy. And there is nothing he can do about it except wait, recover, and hope the sport gives them another chance to finish what Monte Carlo started. Because the real story here was never simply that Sinner got injured. The real story is that men's tennis built its entire 2026 narrative around a rivalry that has barely been allowed to exist. And right when it looked like it might finally return to full strength, it slipped away again, just far enough out of reach to make everyone wonder when, or if, these two will actually get to settle things on the biggest stage available to either of them. So here's the question worth sitting with. Was Sinner's withdrawal simply bad timing, or is it the clearest sign yet that even the most durable player in tennis has limits that are starting to show? Would you rather see Sinner rest fully and come back stronger next year, or push through and risk it for one more shot at Alcaraz this season? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more breakdowns of the decisions shaping men's tennis right now, subscribe. There's a lot more of this rivalry still left to tell.